friends and travelers seeking the secrets of the misty islands. Hello. We step into the magical, lost, and cyclical world of Celtic mythology, woven with rebirth and nature. Life gained meaning through the words of the Druids, the sacred oak forests, and the presence of the magical people of the Tuatha De Danann. Today, we explore the boundless cauldron of the god Dagda, Great Abundance, the goddess Morrígan, who determines the fate of war, and the superhuman battle frenzy, Rhaistrad, of the greatest Celtic hero, Tuatha De Danann. In Celtic beliefs, time is cyclical. Death is the soul's passage to another world, unwin or she for rebirth. Don't forget to like and subscribe to uncover the secrets of this misty and magical life, including the heroics and tragedies of the past. I also love reading your comments. There is an old way of telling Ireland. It begins not with kings on thrones or saints with books, but with a restless island waiting for footsteps. The winds come long before names do. Waves write in a race on the sand, and the hills hold their breath. Into that quiet the first settlers arrive, not by accident, but by design. Pilgrims of a kind who believe that a new world can be made where none has stood before. The medieval learned men who gathered the old tales into the Book of Invasions called each wave a taking of Ireland. The phrase is not a boast. It is an understanding that land and people make a pact, and that the pact must be renewed in every age. The first attempt is full of wonder and sorrow. It is the voyage of Caesar, a woman of uncommon resolve, whose story flows in several streams, yet always returns to the same pool. She hears that a flood will wash over the known world. She will not trust fate to sparing her for being timid. She finds 3 men who will sail and 50 women who will follow. Fintan Mabacra goes with her and Bith and Ladra, and they steer for an island told of in whispers, a place of high green and deep water. They make landfall where the cliffs lower their guard. They name beaches and headlands. They begin to live. Winds scour the grass, and the gulls cry over white water. There is work, then there is song after work. Then there is the relief that comes when a plan has not failed. Says I's people cut timber and set it to shape. They coax the first clearings out of thicket. But a year is not a long time in the life of a world. And the world has decided to keep its promise. The waters rise. The island that seems safe becomes a small ark in a vast grey plain. The men die. The women die. All are lost except for Fid. His story is told with the simplicity of true marvel. He takes on the life of the creatures that can survive the strange new earth. First, he becomes a salmon, carrying his mind like a candle within the cold river. Then he becomes an eagle that sees the shape of the island from above. At last, he is a hawk that watches winters go by like a page turned in a book. He survives, and with survival comes a burden. He will live to remember everything. In later ages, he will tell kings what came before them, and monks will ask him what island was when the first lines were written across the grass. The waters fall back. The island breathes again. A long time passes, counted in the slow growth of oak and in the forgetting and returning of the seals. Another fleet makes its way to the same shore. This people follow a leader named Path. They are not idealists fleeing a doom. They are settlers by intention and craft. They bring cattle and seed and the knowledge of how to use them. They plough and plant. They brew ale and learn to sit together at tables and call it peace. They divide tasks and gather in fields with voices like a cloud of starings. They count the lakes that brighten the land and the new plains that open under their hands. For the first time in these tales, we see a map drawn not only by gods or by the blind will of nature, but by human labor. When a woman seeks water, the well has a name. When a man returns at dusk with a tired dog and a sore back, he returns to a place that can be found again. But Ireland has older tenants, and not all of them are kind. Out of the western sea come the Femerans. They are raiders and rulers of a sort that a poet would call elemental. They are hunger given shape. They are fear made into men. If the Tuatha De Danann will later look like grace and skill and beauty, the Femerans look like storm and rock and teeth. In some stories, they are giants. In others, they are men with the remorselessness of giants. The Parthenonians meet them at Mag-Etha, a plain whose grass remembers the trample of armies. Parthenon rallies his people. The Femerans are driven back to the shore with the sudden ferocity of a people who know that if they lose here, they lose everything they have just learned to love. For a time, Ireland is held by settlers who know the price of the holding, and then the price is called in. A plague comes, and it is not the kind of enemy that can be met with spear or courage. It takes them in one bitter week on a low hill where the wind cannot carry away the sound of grieving. The fields return to wild growth. The cattle wander. The hearths go cold. The sea is the same as it was. It forgets nothing and remembers nothing. Another silence, then another sail. Neame arrives, and with him a people made hard by journey and ready for war if war should come. They know the stories that the land tells even when it is quiet. They build and sow. They watch the sea. The Femerans return not as raiders this time, but as masters who demand tribute. The terms are cruel. 2 parts of everything, grain and milk and children. On Samhain, the night when the old year dies and the doors between worlds move on their hinges. This is the first clear statement in the old Irish myths of tyranny on a schedule. It is not a single atrocity. It is a season written in the blood and hunger of a people. Nimrod fights because there is no other choice that leaves his folk worth saving. He wins battles and loses others. There is a tower on Tory Island that belongs to a Femeran named Conand, and the Indians take it after a blood-black day. The sea answers their bravery with its own iron arithmetic. A Fionn chief named Mo comes with ships like a forest of masts and a mind as cold as the ocean under winter ice. The slaughter is almost complete. The Indians are broken. Their leader dies. Their children look up with the empty eyes of people whose future has been measured and found short. But even this is not the end. Survivors slip away like sparks on the wind. Some go to the cold countries of the north, where the light itself seems to be made of song. Some go to Britain and settle in new fields. Others are carried unwilling into bondage in distant lands where heat stuns the senses and the hills are not green but gold. Those who are held in servitude are forced to carry earth in heavy bags to lay on stony ground. They are given no rest and they earn no favor. They remember their name for themselves and give themselves a new one. Men of bags, Furble, a title that at once records their humiliation and sharpens their will. They wait for the chance to take back the land that they believe is theirs by right of sorrow. The Furble return. Ireland greets them with rain and wind and a kind of weary mercy. They have not come as raiders. They have come to stay. They divide the island in a way that will echo in Irish memory for as long as there are fields to be ploughed and roads to be walked. 5 provinces, 4 at the points of the compass, and 1 at the centre like the nave of a wheel. The 5 sons of Dela are remembered as the hands that drew these lines, each taking a share, each knowing that the act of dividing a land is a pledge to keep it from fracture. A high king, Eokade Mac Eric, is raised. He is praised for his justice and for the simple virtue of being a ruler, who knows that the well-being of the people is the gold of a king. The Firbolg are not a storm. They are a settlement. They strengthen the traditions of law and counsel. They walk the old plains, and the old plains take their footprints as a sign that the pact between human beings and the island is in force again. Beyond the Firbolg, the Femmorins still exist. They are not as strong as they were, but they have not vanished into story. They raid when they can. They take when they can. The sea is their ally. The Firbolg learn the hard lesson that a land can be ordered within and still be under threat from without. There is no single battle that ends the menace. There are many small ones, and these are the hard ones to tell because they happen in lonely places, where no poet stands to watch and no chronicler sits to write. We know enough to know that the courage of a people was not a thing that needed a spectator. In this age, the land itself is a character in the story. New lakes seem to appear in the night. Plains are cleared as if a hand pushed back the trees while no one was looking. The old texts speak of 4s and 5s of enumerations that are really acts of praise. For lakes arise in the time of Parthenon. 12 plains are cleared by Need and his folk when they have breath between storms. The 5 provinces endure in the time of the Firbolg. The counting is a way of holding the island in the mind. To say its features is to bind them to the people who say them. It is also a way of suggesting that the old gods and older powers still move under the turf. A lake that appears in a single night is not a meteorological accident. It is a sign that the story is paying attention to the ground as well as to the people on it. We have said little about the women in these first takings, which is a failure that the stories themselves are keen to correct when they can. Says is the first leader named in the mythic arrivals. She is no shadow behind men. She is the will that dares the sea. Later we hear of women whose names cling to the landscape. Iu is a queen of the Tuatha who will come later. But even now her name is a promise that the island will belong not only to bands of men with spears. The old stories never forgot that the keeping of a field is as much the work of women as the guarding of a ford. If we are to understand Ireland at the beginning, we must imagine not only warriors and kings, but also the long, patient line of women, drawing water, baking bread, tending to animals, teaching children the names of the rivers and the songs that go with them. The Femmorins deserve another word. They are often presented as enemies of light. That is true as far as it goes. But the more you listen, the more you hear that they are also part of the order of things. They are kin to the Tuatha in some genealogies. They marry and are married to heroes and kings. The sea cannot be banished from an island. It can be bargained with and fought and feared, but it must be acknowledged. The Femmorins are the sea in human form. They bring what the sea brings. Danger, yes. Trade, yes. A reminder that plenty is never free of cost, yes. When a leader speaks of tribute to be paid at a season, it is because someone in the tale understood that the harvest has a shadow that is not only weather and blight. It is the obligation that comes with living in a place that can feed you. The Femmorins are that obligation, walking on 2 legs. From the vantage of later ages, the tale of the Firbolg has a plain dignity. They are not gods. They are not giants. They are men who suffered and returned. They governed, and sometimes that is the most admirable adventure of all. They held the island together long enough for the next great arrival to take shape behind the horizon. They did not know that they were setting the stage for an age of marvel. They would not have cared to know it. They had fields to keep and disputes to settle and borders to watch. They built and honored the laws. They gave the High King a throne that did not sit above justice, but within it. The storytellers of monasteries and kings' halls like to speak of how the first takings traced a kind of moral curve. First came the dream of survival in the face of doom which failed but left behind a witness in the person of Fint. Then came the spirited founding under Parthenon, which showed that a land can flourish and then be lost for no fault of courage. Then came the hard years of Nemd, with small victories and great losses, and with the cold lesson that courage, without lasting strength, can be drowned. Then came endurance and return in the persons of the Firbolg, a patience that drew new lines on the map and spoke the names of provinces and kings in a voice that expected them to last. Yet these tellings do not pretend that the story began only with men stepping ashore from a ship. There is a sense in the old writing that the land itself was already clergy and choir, ready to sing if given a reason. The hills around Terra already knew what a kingship felt like in their bones. The river bow had already learned how to be a boundary and a road. The Shannon mirrored the sky in such a way that a poet could not look into it without thinking of both death and birth. When people came, they did not arrive in a vacuum. They arrived into a chorus. That chorus could be a comfort or a warning. It never falls silent for long. We can also listen for the quiet threads that will connect this first chapter to the ones that follow. The Femerans who haunt the shores will not disappear when the two Daenan arrive. They will take new shapes and new names. But the contention between theft and craft, between hunger and plenty, will continue. The practice of dividing land into provinces and naming kings will become the frame that later heroes move within. The story of a flood and a surviving witness will echo whenever a tale is told of a person who knows what the rest have forgotten. The habit of paying a price at Samhain for the right to breathe freely through winter will become the calendar on which the year of the island is written. It is a delight of Irish myth that memory is not one voice. In one strain, the Firbolg are the rightful first men and proud. In another, they are a footnote before the godlike Tuatha take the stage. In one song, Nay is the founder of fields and the foe of pirates. In another, he is only a stone on a path that runs toward the bright doors of Magar. The presence of many versions is not a flaw. It is the mark of a living tradition. A people tells a story again and again because it needs to say something different each time. In times of want, they remember Parthenon's feasts. In times of obligation, they remember Fomorian tribute. In times of rebuilding, they praise the steadiness of the Firbolg. When they long for wonder, they strain their eyes toward the horizon where a new fleet with lights at its prow is coming into view. If we stand with Fintan, the undying witness, on a cliff that knows the taste of salt, we can see all of this at once. We can see the tiny boat of Cesare as it dares the line where sky meets water. We can see Parthenon's people cross a plain. They cleared with their own hands. We can see the bodies of Nemedians in armor shining with wet, strewn on a beach under a cold moon. We can see the quiet ceremonies by which the Firbolg measure land and pledge themselves to keep faith. We can see the sea itself, the indifferent actor who plays both enemy and pathway with equal skill. We can hear the future loud as the march of a god's army coming closer. The chapter closes on a waiting note. The Firbolg have done all that can be asked of a mortal people who come home from a season of bitterness. They have given the island the dignity of order. They have fenced fields and named provinces and raised a high king who remembers that law is a shield for the weak. It is not their fault that they live at the hinge of an age. The new arrival does not come to punish them. It comes because stories have their own tides. The next tide is unlike any before it. It will bring a people whose art is so refined that it seems like magic, whose warriors fight as if in dance, whose kings are the measure of the word splendid. The Tuatha De Danann wait just beyond the horizon. They are not yet in sight, but the gulls sense them and cry, and the wind smells faintly of apple blossom, though the trees have not yet flowered. Before the first carrack of the Tuatha cuts the water, we look back once more at the island that the Firbolg hold and the Forians threaten. A green world under a stone-cold sky. Cattle grazing in meadows that are already part of law. Children chasing one another in the lanes between houses whose smoke rises straight up because the wind is holding its breath. Women grinding grain on cooing a tune that mothers in 100 generations will recognize, though they will not know its name. Men sharpening spears, not because they want war, but because they know that peace is a practice that requires a certain readiness. The lakes that appeared in a night hold the morning light as if they were eyes open to see what comes next. The rivers that will one day be invoked in oaths run as calmly as if there were no such things as kings or battles. Ireland is ready to be taken again, not conquered, taken into a new story. The pact between land and people is about to be written in a brighter hand. That brightness will hurt the eyes. It will be too much for some and a joy for others. It will change what songs are sung in the evenings. It will plant names in the soil that can be tasted centuries later. The first chapter is a memory of hunger, labor, fear, and the kind of indistinct hope that feels like a wind before rain. The second will be a blaze. At the rim of the world, a bank of clouds slid low over the sea and moved like a thought toward Ireland. Sailors later said that the ships hid within that cloud, and that the hulls struck water only when they chose to be seen. Others swore that the newcomers came as a host of brilliant figures stepping across the crests of waves, as if the ocean were a green road. In either telling, the arrival has the dignity of ceremony. The Tuatha De Danann enter Ireland not as wanderers, but as a people already made. Their speech is old and bright. Their craft is so subtle that ordinary work looks like wonder. Their musicians can bind a crowd to silence. Their physicians can call a man back from the grey margin and set him down among the living. Their smiths know the temper of metal as a farmer knows a field at dusk. They bear treasures whose names will ring in Irish memory long after kings are dust. From Fallius they bring the stone that cries out under a rightful king. From Gorius they bring a spear that does not miss. From Findius they bring a sword that no one withstands when it is drawn. From Murius they bring a cauldron that never runs dry and refuses no company. These are not tokens. They are proofs that a people has the favour of gods and the blessing of good work. They make landfall in Connaught, where the wind turns the grass to silver. Smoke from Firbolg hearths rises in steady pillars. The Firbolg have held the island with law and counsel. They are not petty and they are not weak. They divide the land into provinces that fit like pieces of a single thought. They have a high king, Atera, who sits within the law and not above it. When the Tuatha send messengers to treat, they go with courtesy. When they prepare for war, they do not shout about it. The first talk between the two peoples is a plain parley on an open plain known as Maghured, a place that will take a second name later and keep both as scars and honours. Champions meet first, as champions often do when the fates wish to see whether peace is possible. Dagda of the Tuatha stands with the grace of a man born to a throne, though he has not yet claimed one. Across from him steps Shrey, a furball warrior with a sword as heavy as truth itself. The two face each other in a place where the grass still holds dew. Words are weighed. The Tuatha offer a division of Ireland such that both peoples might dwell and thrive. The furball decline out of pride and a sense that a land cannot be shared like meat. They choose the hard road. Both sides retreat to gather their companies. For days the plain hums like a harp string drawn tight. The battle that follows is the first great testing of the Tuatha in Ireland. It is said to have lasted 5 days. The first is a storm of skirmishes with little gain and much noise. The second is a book of duels where names begin to mean something more than a sound. On the third day, Sang and Nada meet again. There is no bitterness in it, only the cold attention to skill that good fighters share. Shring hews down with a blow that lands with such weight that Nada's right arm falls to the ground, still holding its weapon. The shock runs through both armies. The Tuatha carry their king from the field. The furball roar as men who have proved their standing. The fourth day belongs to the furball out of momentum and the courage that comes when a giant has been made to kneel. On the fifth day, the Tuatha gather and their champions move as if a conductor had lifted a hand. Agma drives a wedge through the furbolg. The Dagda advances with a great club that can kill with one end and restore life with the other. The Morrígan is the shadow at the edge of sight, a prophetess of victory whose words are like crows wheeling over a field, beautiful and terrible at once. The furbolg line breaks. The plain keeps what falls on it. The Tuatha stand on ground that is now theirs, though they do not feel triumph. They offer the firbolg and honourable peace. Sang is given a province. His courage is not a thing to be thrown away. The island is large enough to hold both memory and change. Nada's wound is more than a wound. In the law of the Tuatha, a king must be whole in body as a sign that the land is whole in fortune. Dagda cannot rule until he is made entire. The physician dialect sets bone and stops blood. The right creedney and the smith go confer over metal and sinew. Together they fashion a marvel, an arm of silver fitted to the king's shoulder with joints and strength. Dagda rises from his table and moves his new arm with ease. The court murmurs in admiration, but law is law. Silver or not, the arm is not flesh. The throne must pass to another. They choose Brez. He is handsome as a painted god and strong as a young oak. He is of mixed kind, with a Tuatha mother and a Morrígan father. To some, the choice feels like a road to peace. To others, it is a test that they should not need to take. Bry rises to kingship with an easy smile and takes the seat at Terra. At first, the court believes that beauty and strength will be enough. They learn quickly that a king without generosity is a winter without fire. Brez is careful with gifts and stingy with praise. He fails at the sacred work of hospitality. The poets find cold benches at his hall. Warriors go unrewarded. Craftsmen present their work and are waved aside. It is a small meanness that becomes a great one because a king is a mirror that magnifies everything he shows the world. In Ireland, satire is not a toy. It is a weapon sharpened by art and sanctioned by tradition. A poet named Qua Prey wakes from such a night of neglect that words of barbed justice rise in him before his first cup. He composes a short verse that damns a ruler more surely than a spear. It is said to be the first satire in Ireland. The poem draws Brez down in the eyes of his people as if a crown had been lifted from his head by invisible hands. Brez responds to shame with anger. He calls upon his Fomorian kin across the sea. Tribute is demanded from the Tuatha. Hostages are taken. The land feels the weight of a king who believes that rule is a right and not a trust. Change begins in a quiet room where a young man knocks at the door of the hall at Tara and asks to be admitted. The doorkeeper says no unless the visitor can do something that is not already done by someone within. The young man says he is a smith. The hall has a smith. He is a right. The hall has a right. He is a champion. The hall has champions. A bard, they have bars. A magician, they have them in plenty. He smiles and says he is each of these and all of them together. The doorkeeper frowns, goes inside, and returns with a summons. Nada himself wishes to see this man. The young man enters the hall and the company looks up as they would for a bright star at the crest of night. He gives his name as Lugh, son of Caon and grandson of Balor on his mother's side, though he does not linger on that last fact. He is called many-skilled, a title earned not by promises but by acts. Nada sets him tests that would serve as a lifetime's work for other men. Lugh solves them as a player, solves a game that he already knows by heart. He wrestles and plays and sings. He judges, and the unfair find their arguments crumbling at a word. He speaks to the masters of every art in the hall and shows each that he is a peer. He is not arrogant. He is fate. Arriving with a courteous nod, the court moves around him as iron filings move to a lodestone. Even those who worry about the tangle of his kinships cannot deny the lift in the room when he speaks. If the Tuatha are to throw off the yoke of Br and the Forians, they will need a leader who can think in many kinds of light at once. Lugh has the clarity of the craftsman and the imagination of the poet. He has the patience of the judge and the speed of the warrior. He can bend his mind to the ways of healing and the ways of war without confusion. In him, the Tuatha feel their own best nature made visible. Nada watches and understands. The old king is whole again in more than one sense. There is a tale that tells of how the physician's son Mac replaced the silver arm with a living one, calling flesh from flesh until sinew and skin grew, as if from the memory of the body. Diane, jealous of a skill he had not shown, struck his son down, and aimed wept over the grave until all the healing herbs of the world sprang up on the sod and learnt their names from her tears. Whether or not every detail is as the monks set it down, the lesson is clear. The Tuatha do not win by iron alone. They win by knowledge and by a ruthless willingness to pay the cost that knowledge demands. Nada restored does not cling to authority. He asks Lugh to take command against the Fomor. A king who knows when to step back has the stature of a mountain. The gathering for war is not a scramble. It is a festival of skill. Goin forges blades whose edges keep their bite as if sharpened by intention each time they meet a shield. Credney casts rivets and bosses that make a wall of gleaming circles on every shield face. Lugh shapes spear shafts from ash that rings when struck and does not splinter when driven. Dion checked blesses a well near the camp at Slime where wounded warriors will be bathed and will rise with their cuts closed and their breaths deep. The Dagda drags his massive club behind him like a furrow and speaks with the land as if it were a friend. His harp is in enemy hands, but he is content to wait for the hour when songs will be needed more than boasts. The Morgan walks the river Ununius at night and meets the Dagda there. What passes between them is not for common speech, but the tale says that when she rises from the bank, she is pledged to the victory of the Tuatha, and that the battle already knows its ending. Across the water, the Femerins answer in kind. Balor of the Evil Eye is a grandfather now, but the age of his bones has not softened the hard light in his gaze. There is a warning in his life that makes fathers tremble. A prophecy said that he would be killed by his grandson, so he caged his daughter Ethnu in a tower of bright bronze and kept her from the touch of any man. Prophecies are the most stubborn of growths. Cian, a two-ear champion of cunning as well as strength, won his way to the tower and joined himself to Ethnu, not by violence, but by the confluence of will and luck that the old tales called destiny. 3 sons were born. Balor stole them at birth and cast them toward the sea, thinking to break the shape of the future with a cruel hand. One lived. This is the child who comes to Terra with a smile that hides a storm. He is Lugh, when the Femerins muster under Balor, and Ind calls in favours owed to a king who forgot hospitality and remembered power. They do not yet know that the story is already turning under their feet. The armies meet again at Maguire, this time in Sigurd, where stone hills hold the sky like a bowl. The plain is a book already half written, and the second half will be darker but more beautiful. The 2 Arthurs set their camp with neat lines. Fires blink like a constellation fall into earth. The Femerin host looks like the sea when a squall runs through it, black and heavy and loud. Lugh walks the lines and speaks to each company in the language of its work. With smiths he talks of temper and alloy. With healers he names herbs and bones. With warriors he speaks of ground and timing and the moment when a shield should rise, not to block but to blind. He does not pretend to know more than those he addresses. He shows that he understands and honors what they know. It is the kind of leadership that makes other men want to be better than they already are. On the eve of battle, the Dagda goes to the Fomorian camp as a spy and a jester. He is mocked and forced to eat from a cauldron so huge that a foolish man would drown in its broth. He eats it clean and sleeps with a Fian daughter who is pleased to be his ally. He returns with news and with laughter, a combination that would terrify any tyrant if tyrants remembered that joy is a strength. At dawn, the Morrigan stands on a height and speaks. Her voice is not a scream, it is a tide. She names the victory and its fruits. She names the losses and the memory of them. She promises that cows will be in calf and that harvest will be heavy, if the 2 Arthurs stand fast. She promises that enemies will go home without their pride. Her promises are not magic. They are the breath that warriors drink when their mouths are dust. The battle opens with contests of champions. Agma takes a Fian chieftain by the waist belt and drags him through the press like a man dragging a fallen tree out of a river. New fights and works at once, forging spearheads in the rhythm of his thrusts. Dion, Checht and Med pull men from the field like fishermen hauling nets full of life. Each immersion in the well is a return from a door that has swung too far. The Fomorian answer is brutal and efficient. Their ranks have the weight of tides. Balor does not move at first. He is a patient disaster. The lid of his terrible eye is heavy and bound with cords that only a crew of men can lift. When it lifts, ruin pours out like summer drought. Crops wither, faces age, courage turns to ash. The Tuatha have heard all the stories. It is one thing to hear them, and another to stand in the light of that eye and feel your bones. Remember how the world will end. Another dies that morning, cut down by Balar, before the eye is loosed. A king returned to a throne only long enough to give it away. His body lies with a grace that even death cannot steal. Lugh comes to the fore, and the field slowly rouses as if a wind had moved through a sleeping wood. He has the spear that must be held in a vat of water between fights to keep it from leaping to kill on its own. He has a sling stone shaped like a small moon. He has a mind that has waited for this hour since it knew what an hour was. Balor commands his men to lift the lid of the eye, for pull on ropes. The lid rises. The air changes like the breath a house takes before its roof falls in. Lugh takes the sling and swings, not with anger, not with fear, but with the absolute calm that a master brings to his art. The stone flies and strikes the eye so that it is driven out the back of the head. The baleful gaze turns backward and falls upon the Femerans, who have gathered to watch their god of ruin unmake an army. They wither. They break. Balar falls like a tower thrown down. The prophecy ends not with a trumpet, but with a stone crossing a small space, true to the line it was given. In the route that follows, Ind is slain and Brez is captured. He pleads for his life. Lugh does not waste a life if it can be turned to use. What can you give? He asks that sets a value on your head. Buri answers that he can teach when to plough and when to sow and when to reap, so that men will not war with the seasons and lose. He can teach how cattle grow fattest and how honey can be found without breaking the bees. He can teach that a king's due is a tenth, and no more, and that a tenth, taken after the harvest and not before, keeps the bargain clean. Lugh listens and spares him. There are those who call that mercy a mistake. There are more who call it wisdom. Victory that feeds a country is worth more than victory that feeds a pride. After the battle, the Tuatha take back what is theirs and rescue what has been stolen. In a dark hall near a Fian port, the Dagda finds his harp hanging on a wall between two spears. He calls it by name, and it leaps to his hand. He plays, and the instrument sings the three strains that match the three turns of life. The strain of weeping so true that the listeners remember their dead and allow themselves to grieve. The strain of laughter so clean that the listeners drop their quarrels and stand in the same light. The strain of sleep so deep that the listeners lay down their heads even if they stand in armor. When he finishes, the seasons are in their places again. Winter in winter, spring in spring, the land remembers how to be generous. The court at Terra shines in that golden aftermath. The Dagda presides with a belly that is a sign of plenty and a wisdom that is a shelter. Bridge comes with healing and with poetry and with a kindly light that makes a house a home. Anger speaks softly and lovers find the courage to say yes. Agma lifts stones and lifts also the minds of men with feats of strength that prove that power and good humour are not strangers. Goinu keeps a workshop where the air sings with sparks and with the talk of men who love their work. Credni and Luckin take their places by his side, and the harmony of their tools is music that is honest and complete. Dionchek tends the hurt and the sick, and Amd walks the meadows, learning the tongues of the herbs. The Morgan stands on heights and watches the borders. She is not a threat in these days, but a warning that keeps bravery from blowing away like chaff. The leaf isle at Terrace speaks when a true king sets his foot on it, and its cry runs like a silver line down into the roots of the hill. This is the bright age of the Tuatha in Ireland. It is not a daydream. It has laws and tasks and the small irritations of talented people working in close company. It has feasts and hard winters and sudden storms at sea that remind even gods in all but name that Ireland is not a pet to be petted, yet it also has a flavour of ease that comes when a country and its rulers fit as a hand fits the tool it has found by long habit. The cattle are sleek. The fields answer the plough. The poets do not spend their nights composing satires because they are busy composing praise. Messengers ride between provinces and are envied for the stories they carry. The fords are safe. The ring forts are strong. Even in such days, a shadow falls from the future across the page. It is not yet the time when mortals will come to claim the world above for their own. For now the Tuatha stand in open daylight and do not trouble to hide their brilliance, but the wise can hear a hinge moving. Prophecies do not end with a single fulfilled thread. They breed new ones. The sea remains. The Femerans are not gone from the long story, only set back and taught to be cautious. Brez lives and will talk in distant courts about a people whose craft is a wall and a spear. Among the Tuatha themselves there are fissures of pride and grief that will one day widen. Dion killed his son out of envy. Amd gathered the herbs, and men later forgot their names. Nada died with a calm face and a red stain. Lugh saved a people with a slingstone, but also inherited the long consequences that come when a man is both hero and grandson to a monster. For now, it is enough to say that the pact between land and people has been renewed at a higher pitch. The Tuatha are not tyrants. They are guardians, and in their keeping, the island shows what it can be when skill and law and song are honoured. The four treasures are not ornaments. They are truths set in objects. The stone that cries at terror tells a country that authority is not a trick. The spear of Lugh tells warriors that victory belongs to those who train body and mind until both obey. The sword of Nada tells judges that there are times when mercy must step aside for clarity. The cauldron of the Dagda tells rulers that plenty is not for hoarding. A court that remembers these teachings endures. A people that remembers them cannot be made small. So the children of Danu rule. They walk the hills without hiding. Their festivals lace the year with light. At Brigid's day, the first green speaks under the snow, and women bless their thresholds. At Samhain, the doors between worlds shift again, but the Tuatha do not fear those doors. They have friends on both sides of them. On the boy, the salmon turn, and a boy who will one day be a hero watches the water with a thought that he cannot yet name. In Stir, a child is born, who will grow to a fury that breaks armies. In the West, a princess learns to ride like the wind. Seeds of many later stories are planted in this clear weather. They will come into their own when the time ripens. When the Tuatha think of the day their kingship will end, they do not imagine defeat. They imagine an agreement in which they step into the earth and keep it from below while men tend it above. That is a dream that sounds like wisdom when the fires are bright and the night is kind. It will not spare them the sadness that comes when a golden age finishes its measure, but it gives their reign a dignity that no loss can stain. If gods must fade, let them fade as guardians who learn a new way to keep faith. At Terra, in an evening after harvest, Lugh stands with the Dagda beneath a sky that holds more stars than words. The air smells of apples and smoke. The two do not speak much. They do not need to. They hear the country breathing. A poet recites by the hearth, and children lean forward as though pulled by a thread. The stone on the hill is cool and quiet. It will speak when asked. It will be silent when not. The harp rests against the Dagda's knee, and the old lord's hand strays to the strings. A few notes fall like rain on a calm river. There is a sense that the music could call spring from winter if it wished, or bring sleep to an army standing with spears raised. It does neither. It cradles the moment and lets it be. Thus the Tuatha De Danann rise in Ireland, and thus they hold the island for a span that is measured not by clocks, but by the depth with which a people sinks into a place and makes it shine. Their victories do not erase the memory of those who came before, and their errors do not smudge the meaning of what they achieve. When the next tide comes, it will not be because they failed. It will be because stories move. An island has always been a country that keeps time with stories. The soft falling of power can be as grand as any trumpet. The Tuatha De Danann felt it before they named it. The Morrígan stood on dark heights and watched flocks lift at a single clap of wind. The Dagda listened to the ground and heard a faint turning. Not a danger yet, only a new weight on the axle of the world. Brigid, whose touch brought healing and whose voice kindled. Poetry looked into the eyes of children and saw futures that did not bend toward the halls of the Tuatha. Even Lugh, whose slingstone ended the hunger of Bull's eye, walked the ridge at evening and found himself counting stars as if they belonged to other rulers. The island was readying itself for another taking. Such changes come without malice. They come because stories move forward and a good land keeps faith with time. Far away in the country of Brigid, a man climbed a high tower and let his gaze cross the sea. He was named Ith, a kinsman of men whose wanderings had traced long roads from Scythian steppes and Iberian coasts to that hill where the sun was warm and the salt smell was strong. He saw a green island set in shining water. He saw plains that looked as if they waited for cattle. He saw a line of hills like the backs of resting kings. His heart rose as if the sight had called to something he already knew. He gathered a small company and sailed in a neat black ship. The voyage was not a raid. It was a visit. He came ashore and walked through a land that seemed to answer his footsteps. In the north, he reached Alec, where the three kings of the Tuatha held council. They were Meal, Mock, and Emgrain, sons of Serm, and grandsons in the wide family of the Dagda. Their names carried the memory of hazel, of plough, of sun, each a token of a world ruled by skill. He praised the island as if he were a poet sent by the sea. He spoke of fields that invited the hand and of rivers that promised a fair bargain with oars. He advised justice between the three kings and urged them to rule by law and not by jealousy. Praise that sounds like judgment turns sour in the ears of men who fear they are already losing their hold. A quarrel arose at that court, and Ith was set upon by a band of warriors. He fought as a man fights when he knows he stands where he would like to die, and he was brought down with wounds that darkened the grass. His companions bore him away to the ship. He lived long enough to see the green of Ireland sink behind the foam. He died within sight of home. When his kin saw his body, the sweetness of the story changed to the salt of reckoning. They swore to come again, this time not to visit, but to claim. So the Milesians gathered their chiefs and set their keels to water. They were called the sons of Mil Espine, men of a line said to have marched through deserts and along black rivers before they ever tasted Atlantic spray. Among them were Abba, Finn, and Aemon, later to divide rule between south and north if they lived so long. There was Abaddon, proud and forceful, a man the sea would answer with a sharp lesson. There was a Morrígan, brother to them and master of words, a poet and judge whose speech could call a landscape by its spirit rather than only by its names. With them sailed women whose remembrance holds power, Some tell of Scott, a princess by adoption or birth, who took the sea road with the courage of a soldier and the grace of a queen. Others remember Scene, whose name will cling to a place where ships first kissed the sand. They were not one ship or two, but a fleet that worked like a single body, oars and sails moving as if a mind sat on the wind and guided them. The two Arthurs saw them coming. They did not panic. They did not tremble. They called their druids and their seers and asked them to read the sea. The counsel given was both proud and practical. Let the strangers be fair if they wish to be fair. Send them out beyond the 9th wave and tell them to approach again so that the land may judge them on a clean tide. The message was carried across the water in a light craft and delivered with the courtly words of a people who never forgot the form. Even when lightning was about to strike, Emeryn listened. He spoke to his brothers. "We will be just," he said, "not because we are weak, but because we are strong enough to test ourselves." The ships turned from the strand and rowed out until 9 waves rose and fell between their keels and the shore. On the heights, the druids of the Tuatha lifted their arms. The sky went iron. A wind came from the west with the quickness of the lash, and the cruelty of a hand that has been held back for too long. The sea rose in a long round swell and struck the ships as if to roll them into the mouths of the deep. Morrígan did not flinch. He stood on the prow as if it were a judgment seat and spoke to the island. He did not beg, he declared. He hailed the waves as wanderers, and the wind as a mother, and the hill as a brother. He called himself a stag, a hawk, a tear, a spear point, a song, a lake, each word matching the thing that sustains or wounds or heals a country. The poem is remembered as the Song of Emerging, and though the exact lines shift with the centuries, the spirit of it is steady. He spoke not to men, but to the spirit of Rue herself, the sovereignty of the island that may be imagined as a woman, or as a force, or as an old memory of the land speaking through human mouths. The storm slackened as if it were listening. The water flattened. The wind fell away as a tired horse quiets under a good hand. The Milesian ships turned and ran for the shore. Not all were saved. Ibadan, who would be remembered for pride before he was remembered for anything else, cursed the land when the sea slapped the boards of his ship and sprayed his face. A green roller rose like a beast out of sleep and flung his vessel down. He drowned not far from sight of the sand. The sea holds those it takes close to the places where they thought themselves safe. Scott died ashore in one telling among spears and stones on a slope that bears her name in some maps written in the long, careful hands of later scribes. Scene died at the mouth of a river, and Unbound was written to keep her in the story. Loss is not an exemption from destiny. It is often the first price. When Morrígan and his brothers set foot on the island, they moved inward, not as plunderers, but as men who meant to inherit. The first meeting that mattered was not with an army, but with 3 women upon a high place where the land gathers its powers. Some name it the Hill of Uish. Others remember Sleevemish, where cloud sits like a white dog upon the ridge in winter. The 3 were Ario, Bamba, and Fodla, queens in the oldest sense, embodiment of the land's favour. They were not maidens waiting to be wooed. They were elder powers waiting to be answered. Each asked the newcomers to promise that her name would be set on the island so that memory would not lie. Emerg spoke for his people. He honoured Bamba and Fodla and gave them the pledge they demanded. He turned to Rue and promised that her name would be the first and the lasting one. So Ireland received her name as the poets remembered that promise when they looked toward. Teran spoke of the land as a queen to whom the true king gives faithfulness and receives abundance. The three kings of the Tuatha were not idle while their queens shaped the memory of the island. Mcuk, Qual, Mchecht, and Mgrain called their hosts to arms and chose fields that gave them the advantage of ground and the comfort of habit. The Malaysians moved to meet them with the speed of men whose feet already know where to step. The first clash shook at Sly Miss in the southwest, a hard country where the wind tries to push men from the ridge and stones seem to grow out of the grass like knuckles. A second fell at Duhamlegan, where lines of men watched one another across a narrow meadow and counted breaths until the horn broke the watching. The last and deciding stroke came at Tail to where the land once had laboured under a foster. Mother's hands are now held a king's decision. Tilu in the older lore was the woman who raised Lugh and cleared the great plains of myth until she died of the effort. Lugh honoured her with games in her name when the first fruits were ready. The place already knew how to bind, work, and memory into a kind of sacrament. It was fitting, if sombre, that the final struggle of the Tuatha as rulers should take place in a field that remembered a woman's work and a god's gratitude. In those battles, champions found one another as they always do when pride and fate share a field. Quill, whose name holds the hazel tree that feeds wisdom, met Aramon with a sort of silence that often falls before men who are about to decide more than their own afternoon. Mchecht, whose name carries the plough, stood where lines hinge and tried to turn the battle as a plough turns a furrow. Mgrain, whose name bears the sun, lit his company with a ferocity that held for longer than most men can bear. The Milesian answer was steady rather than blazing. They were new to the land, and yet they moved like men who had fought for it many times in dreams. Emergen walked among them, not with a sword, but with words that set men upright. A Bearfin's presence on the field was the cool of a clear stream. Eraman's was the hard shine of a well-kept blade. It is told that the three kings fell in that sequence of fights. Noble in the way brave men are noble when they know they have lost a world and keep their bearing to the end. With the kings fallen, the heart of the Tuatha turned from open war to law and craft. A parley was called so that the last stroke would not be an axe, but a judgment. It was settled that a Morrígan should decide the settlement for his words, had already shown that he could weigh more than a single side of any matter. The Tuatha proposed a just trial by distance. Let the Mylians re-embark and go beyond the 9th wave, then make their landfall. If they can come through a fair storm, they may claim the island without complaint. Emerge agreed because he would not sully his own scale by seeming to twist it. Once again, the ships pulled back and rode in the shoulder of the sea. Once again, a storm rose at the gesture of druid hands and at the breath of old power. Once again, a Morrígan stood and sang to the island, not as a suppliant, but as a partner in a pack that would be as old as the first furrow drawn after that hour. The wind fell, the waves lay down, and the ships took the sand. Now the question could be asked and answered: who holds the upper world, and who keeps the world within? Emerging spoke a division that was both sorrow and wisdom. The Malaysians would take the ground above, the open fields, and the hall roofs, and the cattle buyers where smoke lifts in the evening. The Tuatha would keep the world below, the mounds and hollows where the old light lingers like the spill of moon on a stone bowl. It was not defeat. It was a going down to keep the roots, while others kept the leaves. The Tuatha accepted the judgment with a dignity that has kept their story bright even in retreat. They would become the people of the mounds, the sea, and the word Sid would come to mean both a place of earth and a house of wonder. They chose their dwellings with care. Angus took Brunaboon, the great mound by the Boy, whose long passage meets the winter sun, as if a hand had set it on a hinge with perfect art. There he keeps a house where love is lord, and swans sing at Samhain in voices that sound like a remembered youth. He is the master of bright sleep, and of the moment when lovers know their answer before any word is spoken. Mid-air took a mound at Brilaith, and his story with Eton would later teach that beauty can be reborn from ash, and that jealousy is a slow poison. The Dagda withdrew into the depths where the rivers begin, and watched as the hills learnt to speak in dreams to those who remembered their vows. Brigid walked in and out of the mounds as easily as a nurse goes from bed to bed in a kindly house. The Morrígan stood guard on the borders between seen and unseen, and did not abandon her old work of warning and of promise. Lugh did not sit in one place. He moved where he was needed. A presence in the clatter of a forge when a blade is about to take true temper. A shadow on the road when a king goes out at night to listen to the speech of the poor. The world did not lose them. It learned to look for them differently. A confusion of light near a ring fort at dusk was not only the trick of midgets and the last angle of Sunday. A sudden music heard by a man walking alone was not only the wind through hawthorn. A cow found rich after a hard season was not only luck. The pact held. The Tuatha gave their blessing to those who kept the law and honoured hospitality and remembered to pour a little drink on the ground before they raised the cup. They took their tithe in cattle strayed in a child rescued from a bog where a foot went astray in a man given a verse, so clean that it sounded like water. They punished wrongdoing with a precision that made people careful about insulting singers or cutting lone trees or knocking down ancient stones for new houses. Emerg's own work did not end with that judgment. There were kings to be made and lines to be drawn so that brothers did not fall upon one another before the new realm had even found its stride. Bear Finn took the south, a country of long shores and mountains that hold mists like secrets. Ehrman took the north where the sky stands higher and the wind comes down clean from the uplands. For a time they ruled in amity. In later years they quarrelled and one fell as brothers. Sometimes do when power sits like a stone between them and each thinks he must lift it alone. Their fates belong to the cycle of early kings. What matters here is that the first order of the Emlian age was restraint rather than frenzy, and law rather than loot. Emereg's poem had not only stilled a sea, it had called a way of living into being, a way in which the land is not a prize taken, but a partner served. The Tuatha under the hills organized their own courts and councils. The old treasures were not abandoned. The stone at Terra still knew a true king, even if the king who stood on it wore a mortal face. The cauldron of the Dagda was a promise that no guest would be turned away hungry where the old gods kept house. The spear of Lugh slept under a covering of soft wool and woke only when a hero needed a hand guided by more than muscle. The sword of Nada, shining in its sheath of long memory, reminded judges to cut through confusion without fear and without joy. From time to time, a mortal would wander near a mound and be invited in. A feast would follow that tasted like the best day of childhood. When the guests stepped out again, a year would have passed, or 100. Tales gathered like blackberries in hedges about men who took wives of the Side and returned with hair turned white and hearts broken by the difference in the pace of days. These stories held warning and wonder in equal measure. The new boundary between above and below began to sing in the calendar. At Samhain the doors eased, and men put out food for those who might cross, their own dead among them as honoured as any queen. At Imbolc Bridges day was kept with rush crosses and blessings of fire and water. At Beltane the cattle were driven between twin flames, so that their hides might remember summer and their milk not fail. At Lughnasad men raced and wrestled, and women chose partners in sight of hills that recall Lugh's foster mother and the cost of making fields from forest. The festivals had been old before the Milesians came. Now they carried a double meaning. They were the memory of divine rule and the charter of mortal stewardship written on the wheel of the year. There were fares to be paid for the taking of Ireland, and they were not all paid in battle. Names cling to the story like burrs to a cloak. Tilu, whose toil cleared Mere, was honoured by games that outlived her. Rue, Bamba, and Fodla received the naming they asked and kept it. The three kings who fell left no sons on the high seat, but they left a pattern of dignity that even their conquerors admired. E, whose first praise sparked the invasion, was given burial honours in lands that had not known his voice, but felt the truth of his speech in how quickly his kin came to put his murder right. Scott holds a grave in a past that remembers her. A long cleft where cloud lingers and men cross themselves without knowing why when they ride under it. Kay's name brightens the place where her breath went out and the sea comes in. Within the mounds, the stories of the Tuatha continue to unfold. Angus won Brunaboyan from his father by a trick that is also a perfectly framed argument. He asked for the house for day and night. The doctor agreed as a favour to a beloved son. Day and night make a full measure of time. Angus kept the house not for a span but forever, because the measure he asked for had no remainder. The law smiled and granted the claim. Medea loved Eton, who was born and born again. And in each life her beauty was not a curse but a truth that demanded reverence. Lugh took counsel with those who watched the borders for danger flows along borders like oil along a plank. Bridge kept wells clean and poets honest. The Morgans spoke to men who thought of breaking oaths and frightened them into remembering themselves. It is easy to say that the gods became fairies and leave the matter there, as if a change of names could tell the whole of a thing. The truth is larger. The Tuatha learned a different mode of keeping. They kept the roots. They kept the secret valleys where a man may find himself again after losing himself in courts and quarrels. They kept the quiet behind a harp's last chord, when a hall full of men has gone from laughter to thought without knowing why. They kept the sudden riches of a poor household where a traveller is fed, though the press is nearly bare. And next morning the press proves to hold more than there had been before, because the grace of giving had called another grace to answer it. They kept justice that does not need a mailed hand to show it is serious. They kept terror that is clean and instructive. A cow struck dead without mark for being stolen and then hidden in a ditch is a lesson in the old grammar. A child found again in the morning where no child could have survived, the storm is the other side of that grammar. Above the mounds, the Milesian order settled into names and lineages. Aberin and Eramon took counsel, quarrelled, made peace, quarrelled again and fought, and one was laid down. The high kingship at Terra began its long procession. The Leafile answered and sometimes refused to speak, a stony honesty that embarrassed liars and delighted poets. Guasa was spoken over rulers, Tabus that bound a king to right conduct, and that punished him if he stepped outside, the narrow path that keeps a country from sliding into darkness. Those Guasa were not arbitrary. They were the shaping of a soul by vows fitted to person and place. the kind of exact promises that make freedom possible because they make foolishness difficult. In the borderlands between memory and chronicle, the last sights of the two Arthur in daylight faded like a stain in sunlight. People did not stop telling their names. They lowered their voices when they told them. A man who failed at harvest might blame his stinginess toward a stranger rather than the weather, and be closer to the truth than a man who blamed wind alone. A woman who sat in a doorway in the soft light before rain might hear a whisper that told her which herb to steep for a fever and thank Bridge with a nod. A boy who chose to leave a fairy thorn standing while his father cleared a field might feel the hair lift on his arms and know he had prevented grief. Ireland knew itself as a place where courtesy toward the invisible was not superstition but prudence. Emergin grew old and did not lose the clear ring of his voice. He sat with kings and kept them from the temptation to rule as if the world belonged to them rather than to the law. He taught that a river is a border and a road and a mirror, and that a man who forgets any of these truths will be surprised by something he could have foreseen. He spoke again the names he had spoken to the sea, and found that they tasted of bread and meat and sweet milk, now that the pact had been kept through seasons of sowing and reaping. He died one day as a good judge should die, with his work finished and his friends around him, and the door to the mound standing half open in the corner of his room like a remembered promise. The twilight of the gods was not a failing of light, but a deepening of it, as when afternoon settles into a gold that is calmer than noon, and more beautiful for being about to pass. They were not snuffed out, they were gathered in. The Malaysians did not shatter what had come before. They built upon it and were held to it by law and by the quiet watchfulness of those who now lived inside the hills. The land did not change its nature. It changed the terms of its friendship. On certain nights, cattle loaded as if answering a call from under the earth. On certain mornings, fishermen found boats tied fast with knots no man in the village had tied. At certain fords, men swore oaths and felt their lips go cold if they lied. In such ways, the old and new worlds held each other up. On an evening after the first long peace, a boy walked to the edge of a mound and pressed his ear to the turf. He heard music as faint and full as the memory of his mother's singing when he was very small. He could not quite hear the words. He did not have to. The tune itself promised that the world was larger than the fields he had helped to turn that day. He stood and looked across a landfold full of mist. Lamps prick-wrecked here and there. A fox barked twice. The boy smiled and went home. He would grow to plant oats and to speak the king's Irish and to tell his children not to cut the lone thorn. He would sit in the doorway at dusk and feel grateful for the blessings of invisible neighbors. He would not mock his own good fortune by pretending he had made it alone. The twilight passed into night only in the sense that a curtain makes a room more intimate. In that room, men and women learned to trust their work and their words. Under the floorboards, the old company kept watch. Once in a while, a door opened and someone stepped through. A man came back with silver on his tongue. A girl came back with a story that would not let itself be forgotten. A cow came back with milk like cream. A king came back with a heart that had learned how to be light while still being strong. When such things happened, the wise did not ask too many questions. They brewed tea and cut bread, and those who do not drink tea with us, but who like to know that we are grateful. So ended the open rule of the two Dean, and so began the long age of the Mylean kings. A clean division and a living connection held at once. The mounds shone from within on cold nights. The hills carried their secrets as if they were crowns worn under shores. The rivers kept running. The poets kept speaking. The law kept its edge. The island took a breath and began a new chapter in which men with mortal blood would play the leading parts, while the older company moved the props and cued the music and smiled when the play went well. It is right to call it twilight, not because darkness followed, but because the color of the light changed, and because beauty attended the change. The gods had stepped into the hills, but the island did not grow quiet. It passed the torch to men and women whose names strike flint from the tongue. The court at Einmarch gathered its champions under a roof that sounded like rain when the bard sang. Ulster stood like a spear pointing to the north, and in its point lived a company who would make the world believe that a mortal life can blaze as brightly as any divine lamp. They were the Red Branch. They were a fellowship of courage and hunger, quick laughter and quicker temper, bound by honor and by the expectation that no one would call himself a hero and then step aside when his name was spoken. Their king was Conabar Magn. His hall stood within earthworks that looked like a sleeping beast, and its long benches saw feasts and councils in equal measure. Here a boy entered whose name was not yet written in iron. Here a queen in the west would find an answer she did not intend. Here a people learned that the tale of gods becomes the tale of men when men decide they will carry it. The ground itself remembered why stir must sometimes pay dearly to be glorious. Long before Conabar, the people had once seized a man named Crunchu and forced his wife Macho to run a race, though she was near to giving birth. She outran the king's horses and reached the post with her hair flying as if she were a banner, then fell and brought forth twins at the finish line. She spoke a curse before she closed her eyes. She said that for 9 generations the men of Stir would suffer the pains of labor at the time of their greatest need. It was a judgment that matched insult with lesson and turned pride into a tax that would come due whenever the island wanted to test whether courage can live without numbers. The curse slept in the blood like winter in a seed. It would wake when the Western Queen marched. Conchier was a king of mixed light. He could be just and he could be cruel. He kept poets and judged quarrels and held the Red Branch to a standard that would break lesser men. His mother Nessa had placed him on the throne with a cunning that bards remembered with unease. Yet even those who hated him most admitted that he made a bright court, and that under his gaze a young warrior learned to stand straighter. The hall at Ian Marcher trained a troop of boys who fought with wooden spears in play that drew blood too often to call it a game. In those fields, a child named Satanta asked the way to the court, and was told that one does not enter the boy troop without first being counted. He walked into their ring alone. They fell on him for insolence, and he put them down with a grace that made the onlookers blink. 3 times the troop rushed him. 3 times he broke them as a sea breaks a boat that is badly trimmed. The heat in him had the color of fate. To cool him, the elders plunged him into vats of cold water, one after another, until he stood calm with steam rising from his shoulders and the butts of spears tapping the floor in respect rather than anger. The story of his naming is a lesson in how honor is born. Con the Smith invited King Conabar to a feast and set a great hound to guard the gate. Setanta stayed behind to finish a game of hurling and came later, moving fast across the dusk with a ball at his foot and a stick like a spark in his hand. The hound rushed at him with a roar that lifted dust from the path. The boy did not flinch. He struck the ball into the hound's mouth so that it stopped the beast's breath. Then he seized the jaws and tore them open and laid the animal down. When Culan and the king came from the firelight to see what had happened, the boy stood with his face like a drawn bow. he offered himself at once as recompense. He said he would be the smith's guard until a new hound could be reared. Conabar breathed out as men breathe when they realized that a state of war has become a treaty. "You have won the right to a new name," he said. "From this hour you will be called the Hound of Coolin." Cuchulainn bowed, and the sound of the name took root in the rafters. His blood was mortal and more. Dane was his mother, and Swaldom his reputed father. But in the light that the old stories keep for truths that do not fit record books, Lie of the Long Arm laid a claim to the child, a claim that showed in the boy's swiftness and in the unnerving brightness of his eye when anger was near. He grew like a hawk. He learned with an appetite that ate sleep. He travelled east to Alba to learn art and pain from Scath, the woman of shadow, whose school stood on a rock that looks down on a black sea. There he learned the salmon leap that carries a body where walls think they are safe. There he learned the thrust called the gay bulgar, a weapon thrown with the foot that blooms in the body like a thorn tree and is drawn out only at the cost of blood that no man can spare. There he fought Eofi Scathic's rival, and won with cunning and with the strength that usually belongs to men 20 years older than he was. A night of joining followed, and a son named Kona would one day come west, seeking his father with doom at his shoulder. Long before that sorrow, Culainn returned to Ulster and to the place where his life would draw its sword on behalf of a people. The sky was clear when the spark that would become a war was struck in a court far to the west. In Cruichon, the Queen Medba measured wealth with her husband Ale, and found that she lacked one thing to match him. He had a great white bull named Finban, proud and massive, a beast that made men boast as if they had fathered it. Med believed no one should say that her riches were less than any man's. Word reached her that in the east, in the glens of Cully, there was a brown bull whose fame ran ahead of him like fire before wind. He was called Don Cooling. Meb sent messengers to borrow the bull for a year with rich promises and friendly courtesies. The owner was willing until a drunken envoy bragged that if the loan was refused, the queen would take the bull with swords. Pride answers pride with hardness. The bargain failed. Medopi pulled Khan and all its allies to arms. She did not march only for cattle. She marched because her sense of balance had been insulted and because no queen, who starts a balance, must be seen to accept losing. Ulta should have met the raid with an army. Instead, the curse of Macha ripened. At the first shock of the queen's marching feet, the men of Stir bent double with pains that tore them as if they were giving birth. The halls rang with groans. The fords saw no shields. The roads held only a boy with ashes on his skin and a charioteer with hands like knots in oak. Cuchulainn already had the habit of moving toward trouble as if it were a friend. He placed himself at the borders and announced a simple law. He would allow any host to pass, so long as they sent a champion each day to fight him in single combat. He would hold the ford until the men of Stir rose. It was madness, and it was the only choice that upheld the honor of a people whose bodies had betrayed them. Lugh, his charioteer, took the reins, and the two moved along the line of rivers that bind a blade on wheels with a voice. The battles at the ford belonged to a book of their own. Champions came from Cairn and Meath, and from far lands, where rumour of glory grows like fruit in summer. Some were braggarts worthy of the ditch. Some were men who could kill a thought before it is formed. Cuchulainn met them all with the look of a craftsman who delights in his craft. The rias came on him in some fights, that war spasm in which his body twisted and flames seemed to flare from his hair, and one eye sank deep while the other jutted out so far that birds might perch on it. It is said that his mouth opened so wide that his jaw touched his chest, and that a column of blood rose above him like a pillar. The image is not meant for doctors. It is meant to show that rage can make a man into a stranger, even to himself, and that the island will sometimes lend. A hero borrowed power that no one should want to keep. The boy troop of Inmarcha loved him and feared him. When they tried to join him, he sent them back with a laugh and a stroke, unwilling to let children die as ornaments to his story. Bards came to measure the courage that a single man could show at a dozen crossings. They found that courage is more than an act. It is a habit that must be renewed before breakfast and after sunset with the same clean decision. Between fights, Cuchulainn harried the host with tricks that would shame a fox. He cut down a tree to block a road, then sat on it, polishing his spear and singing so that men felt silly charging at a singer. He pulled a hair from his head, wrote a challenge on its thickness, tied it in knots, and left it across a path. Men who strained to read that message felt already beaten before the next day's champion stepped into the river. The deepest wound he took at the ford was not a blade cut. It was the duel with the foster brother he loved. Fergus Emro, once king in Ulster and a man of great appetites and a generous heart, had gone into exile after the affair of Deirdre and the death of Naos. He stood now with Queen Med and led part of her host for reasons that mixed wounded pride with loyalty to his word. In his company marched Ferdiad, Siu Shalaine's friend from the days in Alba, a man whose spear knew the taste of victory and whose laugh could fill an evening. Med played upon his honor until he could not refuse the summons. He met Cuchulainn at the ford called Afir. For 3 days the two friends fought. They changed weapons. They changed tactics. They broke off at night to send food to each other because courtesy does not go out of the door when war comes in. The 3rd day both knew that courtesies had been paid and that there would be no more nights. Cuchulainn used the secret art learned from Scathach. He sent the gay Bolgar along the water so that it rose under Ferdiad's guard and did what it always does. Ferdiad fell, and speech left him, except for a sound like a man saying farewell to his own body. Cuchulainn held him and sang him out of the world, and the ford kept both their faces for a time like a mirror that loves. The host of Conn moved despite all this pain. They took the brown bull of Cully and sent him west with a guard that feared both gods and men. Altar staggered to its feet at last. The curse lifted by the clock of fate rather than by merit. Conchor gathered his men. The red branch roared like a river after Thor. Fergus met Cuchulainn, and the younger man remembered a favour owed. In a subtle exchange that only heroes understand, Cuchulainn yielded the field to Fergus once, so that later, when the tide was higher and the stakes were greater, Fergus would return the favour and withdraw his division at Cuchulainn's call. Such bargains are the ligaments of victory. Queen Medbar survived the route, because even in defeat she was brave, and because there are some people whom the world refuses to kill for fear that stories would be poorer without them. The end of the cattle raid is not the end of its meaning. The two great bulls found one another and fought as if the island throve on the deaths of kings. The brown bull tore the white bull and carried part of him east until his heart broke and he died in Ulster with dust in his nostrils. In some tellings, he tossed his head and scattered the pieces of his enemy so that place names were born. The field keeps such names like a rosary. So the cattle raid ended not with a feast and not with a treaty, but with the long silence that follows when exhaustion replaces courage, and men look down at their hands and wonder what they have shaken and gripped for so many weeks. No tale of altar stands alone. Beside the thunder of the raid sits the quiet tragedy that made enemies out of kin. Duri was born under a prophecy that her beauty would bring war and sorrow. Conchobar placed her in the care of a woman with every intention of making her his bride when she was of age. She saw Na, son of Wisilu, and loved him with the kind of love that does not ask permission. He loved her and took her hand as if it had been meant for his palm since the world began. With his brothers Arden and Ainle, they fled to Alba and lived by hunting and by memory. Fergus swore safe conduct when Conchobar sent word that they might return without fear. The king's promise was rotten. He divided their party at a feast and let Rowan MacDur kill Nuaz and his brothers. Fergus went into exile in rage. Deirdre was made to sit by Conchir and listen while the king spoke of power as if power is a bed that can be warmed by someone who hates the man who lies in it. She let her head fall against a stone in a chariot and broke her own life. A woman who chose her death rather than be a jewel in a tyrant's crown. Alter never forgot that. The Red Branch never forgave Conchobar for teaching them that loyalty to a king can be divided by loyalty to justice. This sorrow seeds other sorrows. Cushane later killed a young stranger on a shore, without knowing that the boy was his son. Con le Scarth had set a gaze on him, that he must accept no name and tell no story until he reached Ian Mahar. Chuan felt the rising power in the boy's arm and heard the truth in the ring of his speech and still could not resolve the knot. He fought and used the gay Beulah because his pride and his fear together overruled what the heart whispered. When the boy died, he spoke his name and the world tilted for a moment as if there were no difference between sea and sky. There are times in the altar tales when even the greatest stand, revealed as men bound to fates that give no care for a father's hope. The end of Culain belongs to the bitter harvest of Ulster's fame. Enemies learned his guac. They learned that he must not eat dog and that he must not refuse a meal when it is given in sincerity. 3 hags cooking a hound on spits of thorn met him at a crossroads and invited him to share their food. He saw that to keep one vow he must break another. He ate a piece of the dog with a face that already looked like a mask. That night the nails of fate began to bite. In the fights that followed, prophecies budded and opened. His charioteer leg fell. His horse, Leithmarcher, came to him with tears on its cheeks and would not let any other hand touch its bridle. Spears wounded Culain in the way that poets say 3 queens of death had decreed. In the end he faced a host alone by a lake where reeds whisper old names. He had no wish to fall with his face in the weed. He bound himself upright to a pillar stone with his own belt so that he would die standing. For a long time none dared go near him, for terror lived in that stubborn posture as much as courage did. When a raven settled on his shoulder, men believed that the Morgan had come to claim him. They approached and found the life gone from a body that still looked like a threat. Conall Cernach took vengeance for him, and Lugh, who had struck the last blow, paid with his head. The Red Branch learned what every brotherhood of heroes must learn. A name can be as heavy to carry as a boulder and as fragile to keep as glass. The stir cycle closes with more than blood. It closes with a mirror held to the face of a people. The tales praise strength, yet they never pretend that strength is a cure for grief. They lift kings high, yet they always remember that a king who breaks the covenant of hospitality and fairness will be punished, if not by enemies, then by the story itself. They delight in cunning. Yet cunning, unwed to honor, is treated as a poor man's theft, not as a virtue. The heroes of Alter stand taller than life and are finally brought low by the same forces that govern any house: pride, love, the willingness to keep a vow that will cost too much, the inability to break a habit that no longer serves. The best of them know this even as they ride to their deaths. They do not ask for pardon. They ask for witnesses. The island gives them that kindness. It remembers where they fell. It remembers what they said. It lets their names fill rooms whenever winter runs long. And the only riches at hand are the old stories. Elsewhere in Ireland, the Fianna will soon be taking to the woods, hunting by day and singing by night, writing a different book of heroism for a later chapter. The Tuatha are within the hills, listening as men boast and repent and boast again. The kings sit at Tara and count the gears that will keep them from ruin. In Ulster, the wind goes on, catching grass in 1,000 busy hands. A woman stands at a door and looks down a road where her man will not return and hopes that the bards will tell it right. They do. The red branch remains a banner and a warning, a lesson that a country must sometimes be defended by one man at a ford, and that the price of such defense is almost everything he has. After the thunder of stir waned, the island drew a new breath. It filled its lungs with the sense of pine and heather and the wild sweetness that comes from open moor after rain. The next age did not gather its heroes under a single roof. It let them range. They were the Fianna, a fellowship bound by honor and by the old hospitality that makes a house safe and a road honest. They hunted by day and kept watch by night. They served the High King when the island called and served the land itself when no king remembered to ask. Their battles braided with songs until one could not be told without the other, were exalted the war band of a court. The Fianna exalted the wit and endurance of warriors who belonged as much to forest and river as to any throne. The man who would become their greatest captain was born into a feud that drove him into the shadows before his first tooth showed. He began as Dem, the son of Cumhal, of the line of Bushen and of Muir, whose father was the druid Tashmac New. Cole had stolen Muge rather than lose her to a refusal, and that theft stained his fate with the dark oil that sets any story owl light. Golmac Morna met him at Connacha near the Liffey and struck him down, then took the captaincy of the Fianna for himself. MJA could find no peace in her father's house. She found shelter with Fiacom Conchin and his wife, who passed the infant into deeper care. 2 women raised the boy in secret. Bodmal, the druidess, and Lithluacra, the fighter, taught him to move like weather through the sleeve. Bloom would stalk on leaf mould without sound to read wind with the skin of his cheek and to know a lie by listening to the breath that carries it. When he stood straight and looked at the horizon with a steady mouth, the women named him Fionn, fair, for the light in his face, and for the truth they wanted the world to see when it looked at him. His first claim to the oldest kind of knowledge began beside the boy, under hazel trees, whose roots drink a river that remembers more than any book. There lived a poet called Phanesis, who had spent 7 years trying to catch a single fish. The salmon of knowledge had eaten the 9 nuts that fell from the hazels of wisdom and swam, with every art and answer nestled in its flesh. The poet set a boy to watch the fire while he stepped away. The fish blistered in the pan. The boy tried to save it by turning it and burned his thumb. He put the thumb to his mouth without thinking, as any child does, and the world spoke. Fionn took the fish to the poet with eyes he could not hide. Finn saw at once that the prophecy that had kept him by the river had spared him. He gave the salmon to the boy. Fionn ate, and the door in his mind stayed open forever after. When a riddle needed breaking or a path needed finding, He pressed that thumb against a tooth and let understanding move like a river into a lake. He stepped then into the story without stooping his head. High King Cormac met Helterra in the manner of men who grasp with one hand and give with the other. Every year at Samhain, a being named Island came from the Cid and played a tune so sweet that even iron went soft. The court fell into sleep as if a hand had drawn a cloak over their faces. Island blew fire and terror burned to its stone bones. Year after year, the same shame. Fon asked the right to stand the watch. He asked for the spear with the keen head whose heat would keep his eyes open against enchantment. Some say it was the spear of Fiocna. Others say it was a gift of the two Arthur. Fon held the barbed point to his brow until the pain was a bell that rang him awake. Island came with music that would have sobered a drunk and steadied a king. Fon did not sleep. When the flames leaped, he ran through them, the spear singing in his hand, and drove it home. Island fell with a cry like a storm emptied in a moment. Terror woke to ash and to triumph. Golmac mourner bowed to the judgment of the hall and yielded the captaincy to the young man who had kept the island from the humiliation of enchantment. From that hour led the Fianna, and the land seemed to breathe easier with him in command. To be of the Fianna, a man had to be more than strong. Tests waited at the edge of every camp. A candidate stood in a pit as men flung javelins, and he leaped them without a scratch. He ran through a forest while dry switch and green twigs sang unharmed around him. For speed without care does not suit men who live among trees. He sprinted through a long field with his hair braided and his mouth full of water and could not spill a drop, or let the braid shake loose. Signs that he could carry a message without losing the king's words or his own composure. He had to be a poet, for the Fianna carried law in song and wrote memory in the air each evening. He had to pledge that he would not accept a dowry with a wife, because a warrior should not bind his honor to purchases. He had to promise to defend women and the poor and to protect guests, even when they arrived without warning or gift. He needed a good name in his tribe and could bring no feud into the ranks. If he could not fight without stepping back, he could not stay. If he could not sing for his supper, when meat ran thin, he could not stay. So the company gathered men of blade and men of verse until the two arts became one. Their daily life was a movement through seasons that stitched them to the land like thread through cloth. They hunted boar in oak woods with spears that looked dull until they were thrown. They coursed deer with hounds whose names carry their own tales. Bran and Skylung were most faithful hounds with minds behind their eyes. The bards remember that they were born of Twyron, sister to Fon, who was enchanted into a hound by jealousy and set to whelp in a kennel. When the spell broke, the pups stayed hounds and kept faith with the uncle who knew them. No battle could make them turn back. No hunger could make them bite an innocent hand. In winter camps, the men of the Fianna kept a hard law of fairness and welcome. The champion's portion, that piece of meat richest with juice and closest to bone, went to the man who had proved himself that day. The old tales relished the quarrels that rose over that slice, because honor must have an edge, or it dulls. Fon kept order with a glance, a gesture of the hand, or when necessary, with the flat of a steel that reminded men that pride has borders. They slept under hides and in roundhouses that sprang up overnight, as if a band knew the spell of timber as well as of iron. In spring, they followed the green north. In summer, they lay on hills and watched for sails. In autumn, they guarded the roads that grew crowded with surplus grain and late cattle. In all seasons, their law of hospitality ran ahead of them like a morning star. Fion's power drew not only from muscle and mind, but from the web of kindness and trickery that tied him to the other world. He married Sardba in a tale that begins with pity and learns the cost of absence. A dark druid called Fair Dwaric changed Sardba into a deer because she refused his advances. She ran through forest with terror in each breath. Fionn crossed her path while hunting and raised a spear to end the chase. His hounds recognized a kindness beyond scent. They licked the deer's face and wed. Fionn lowered his weapon and set his hand gently on the neck of the beast. The spell broke when human mercy touched enchanted skin. Sadbur stood before him, washed by tears and by relief. They loved and married. In the safety of Almu, she carried his child, but the druid used a trick of shape and borrowed voice to draw her from the fort while Fionn was away. The spell fell again. She became a deer and ran into shadow. Fionn searched through a full year of hills and never found her. He found instead a boy in the wood, wild as a wren and fearless as a trout. He named him Own, Little Thorn, for the way the child moved. The boy grew into a poet whose lines walked from mouth to mouth for centuries. In those years, Fionn served Cormac Mochmer with a relation that was less obedience than an alliance between men who understood what a kingdom needs to survive. He guarded the king's roads and fords. He fought dire dawn from oversea at Venta, in a legend that loves the grand scale of ships dark on the water, and a strand littered with the gifts of war that no one wanted. He stood in the hall at Terra and let his hounds sleep at his feet, while he judged whether a champion had earned the first slice, or whether a poet had earned the reward that keeps songs from going sour. He made war when a foreigner tested the coasts. He made peace when a proud neighbor learned that a smaller insult can be mended more easily than a large one avenged. He was not perfect. He could be slow to forgive. He could be quick to set a perilous test. But his errors wore the face of a man who bore weight, and who kept others from buckling under it. He outwitted monsters whose bodies were less terrible than their habits. There was the great man Serban, who guarded a rowan tree whose berries granted youth, and whose temper was an axe without a handle. When Fionn's men begged fruit for a sick woman, he refused with a laugh that had no kindness in it. Golmac Morna, by then reconciled, and as massive as an oak from root to crown, met him and struck. The fight ground the air like millstones. Gaul brought him down, and the berries saved the woman. The Fianna shared them out with care, because grace, cheated by greed, is not grace. There was also the figure of the black hag of the mill, who ground the hearts of warriors into flour to bake bread for her appetite. Fionn met her with the sort of practical intelligence that leaves no room for fear. He turned her mill to dust and left her cursing in a language that only hills know. Not every victory was clean or possible. The tale of Diarmuid and grain is a lesson written so calmly that the reader feels the edge only when the blood comes. Grain was daughter to Cormac, and promised to Fionn in a match that looked wise on paper and sour in the heart. At the feast, she looked down the line of benches and saw a face that woke her as surely as any trumpet. Diarmuid sat among the Fianna, with a beauty that had cost him trouble since he first looked into a pool. He bore a love spot on his face that charmed any who looked at him. Grain set a gaze upon him. She bound him by sacred obligation to take her away. He refused, as an honourable man must refuse. She set the gaze on him again with the art that only a woman in a story knows how to use. He could not break it without breaking himself. They fled into a long pursuit that stitched the island with hiding places. They slept on the bed of Dermod, a folded frame that rises in a circle of stones on more hills than any other landmark in a story. Angus Og, Lord of Young Love, sheltered them with a cloak that made an instant house. Once they crossed the ford at Athlone on the points of spears, while Fon waited on the far bank. Once old women loyal to Fon found them and gossiped them into danger. Once the warrior Enos of the rough hand tracked them and died with a grin because his death gave the couple a few more weeks of peace. The island itself took a wordless side. 4 caves opened and hawthorns leaned, and rain fell at the right hour to blur fresh tracks. At last the pursuit grew thin. Fon's anger cleared to a dull ache. He accepted the return of Diarmuid upon terms that looked like forgiveness. Years passed. Then in the north, at Ben Bolbin, a boar appeared whose hide was prophecy made animal. It bore the mark of the doom laid on Diarmu long before by a father whom he had shamed. Fon and Diarmuid hunted together as men who have not forgotten the old love, but who cannot quite remember it either. The boar charged, and Diarmuid slew it after a fight that left the earth churned like a field after the plough. The tusk opened him from thigh to bone. Fionn had in his gift the power to heal by bringing water in his hands. Twice he walked to the well, and twice he let the water slip through his fingers out of an old bitterness that had not died. On the 3rd trip, his grandson Oscar threatened him with the final anger that sons' families. Fon cupped the water at last and ran, but the spark in Darmweed had gone out. Fon's grief that day made mountains look small. He had let love sour into an unpardonable delay. The story does not excuse him. It lets him live with it. The years of Fon's command were filled with deeds that smaller tales have cut and set like jewels in many frames. Celt Macronane ran faster than deer and could tell the name of every hill and why it bore it. He lived long and spoke to a future island with courtesy, telling St. Patrick what had been when oaks were thicker and men thinner. Oscar, son of Oisin, burned like a star across night skies and then was gone. Fergus' true lips could praise without lying and could satirize without cruelty. Gifts worth more than any javelin when men sleep under strange roofs. The Fianna held the roads at Beltane and Lughnasad, so that cattle and corn might move without fear. At Samhain they stood rings around, lonely places where spirits walked and kept the living from the dead and the dead from the living in a peace that suited both. There were moments when the other world laid a hand across their work, as a mother lays a hand on a child's head in passing. A harp heard far off would call the men to a small mound, and a door would open, and a host would pour out in green and gold. A girl with hair like wheat in late sun would ask for help with a task that sounded trivial and turned out to be a lever under a stone no mortal could move alone. A night of feasting would pass under a hill in joy without wine or sleep, and when they stepped out, the sun would stand in a place that did not suit the men's bones. They learned caution and respect. They never mocked a mound. They never cut a lone thorn. They never refused a guest who came at dusk with a tale too large or too small. In time, the last and worst battle came, as it always does for bands that live by courage and song. It was at Gabra, near the mound at Tyloo, where the island often asks for decisions. The High King's house had quarrelled with the Fianna over rights and tributes, and the proud arithmetic of honour. Words failed. Spears answered. The field filled with men who knew one another too well. The Fianna fought as they had always fought, with laughter, and with fury, and with a knowledge of ground that made each tuft of grass a friend. Oscar cut through the High King's ranks as a plough through sod in May. and fell there with a wound that no poet can fully describe without setting his book down. Gul Mac Morna died without complaint, a bull at last on his own red field. Many bright names went dim. Fon himself did not die where the songs wanted. Some say he fell soon after at the buoy and went into the mound with a quiet word. Some say he sleeps beneath a hill with the Fianna in full gear, waiting for the hour when Ireland most needs its old friends. There is a story that he will wake when a horn is blown 3 times at a certain low and a man speaks his name without fear. The fact that people still remember to blow the horn from time to time is a kind of prayer disguised as mischief. One story carried across the sea of centuries more than any other. Oyen rode out one day and met Nam of the golden hair, a princess of Tir Nog, where no one ages and where every day tastes like a festival found at the bottom of a long week. She loved him at a glance that had the clarity of water and asked him to come with her. He did, for his heart had never refused beauty and would not begin. Then in the land of youth he hunted and sang and loved and forgot to count. After a time that felt like 3 years, he longed to see home and begged leave to ride back on a white horse that must not touch earth. He found Ireland changed. Trees looked younger. Fields stood where none had stood. Halls he had known were green hummocks, and farmers cut turf on their roofs. He asked men where the Fianna were, and they smiled with a kindness that hurt. He saw labourers straining at a stone and leaned to help. The girth slipped. His foot touched ground. He fell like a struck oak. Age poured into him as if a dam had broken. He tried to call for nay and saw only the skins of his hands. Some say he lived to speak with St. Patrick and argued with the holy man about the worth of poets and of feasts and of warriors who kept laws older than any church. In those talks, gathered later into a long conversation, the past and the new faith sat by the same fire and tried to find out what parts of the old world could live in the new without shame. Oisin died as a poet should, with stories in his mouth and the faces of friends before his eyes. The Fianna left more than graves and boasts. They left a way of being that has a clear line through it. Honour must be nimble and not stubborn. Hospitality is not a tax, but a pleasure and a duty. The land is not a prize to strip, but a partner to respect. A warrior must be a student of words. A poet must know how spears look in a man's hand when rain is blowing sideways. Love asks things that law cannot cover, and law asks things that love cannot excuse. Mercy waits to be taken, and often is not taken until it can no longer help. The other world is not somewhere else. It is a door in a hill, and a voice on a road, and a light in the corner of an eye at dusk when you think you are alone and are not. Even after the battle at Gabra, the songs did not stop. Sight is said to have lived longer than others, with a lightness in his bones that let him step into later halls and tell who built which wall and why the builder laughed on the day he set the last stone. He told Patrick where deer used to drink and where kings once promised to rule by laws they did not write. He spoke of Fon with a fondness that never softened the truth. He spoke of Gaul with a fairness that made enemies into men again. If a monk smiled when he heard that a hound once recognized the soul of a woman, Sai did not object. He knew that faith and fable can sit on the same bench, and that only fools insist that benches seat only one. When people tell the tales now, they travel on feet older than any road. Children learn Bran and Skyling before they learn the names of constellations. Men who have done wrong and admit it still whisper Dymoid's name with a respect that has regret in it. Lovers say grains softly as if it were a vow to keep desire from turning cruel. Old men who never left their parish speak of Tonnog as if they had seen its shore and turned back because there was work to be done. A hill at evening can look like a shoulder about to shrug. A ring of stones in a field can look like a bed waiting for a long night. The Fianna belong to the open country and to any house that keeps a kettle and a story hot. If the stir tales show the fire a single hero can make, the Fenian tales show the warmth that a fellowship can keep even when wind cuts and meat is thin. Fon did not turn his band into saints or kings. He turned them into custodians of a way of living that kept Ireland safe in the spaces between laws. He could smell weather in a line of ants. He could read trouble in a late rider. He could press his thumb to his tooth and find a path where the ignorant saw only thorn. He could forgive enemies sometimes and fail to forgive when it mattered most. He could bury a friend and stand upright and give orders with a tone that kept boys from breaking in too. He could sit at a fire with a face that made the very flames pay attention. This chapter of the island ends without a door closing in anger. It ends with the feeling that the men have gone to sleep in a place we could find if we were only brave or foolish enough to look. A horn waits by a lake. A hound listens in her dreams and lifts her head. A poet wakes in the night and finds a line in his mouth that tastes like water from a deep well. The Fianna are absent the way stars are absent at noon. They are still there. They are simply behind the light that the day has chosen to wear. A crown in Ireland was never only a circle of metal. It was a contract between a person and a place, and the place had a voice. Long before scribes pressed Latin across vellum, a king stood on a hill and felt the turf answer under his feet. Tara was the heart of that understanding. From its ridge, the ground fell away like a map laid on a table. 5 great roads ran from its flanks, not drawn by any single hand, but worn by centuries of feet and wheels. The stone that spoke for the land stood there, a pillar set into the high earth. It was called the Leofile. When a rightful king stepped upon it, the stone cried out. The sound was not a noise so much as a promise. It announced that the pact between ruler and soil had been renewed for another span. Kingship came with instructions as clear as a well-kept code. They were not laws written by a conqueror for the conquered. They were agreements that bound both sides. The Brawns trained their minds in a craft that was as exact as Smith. They learned the weight of a case the way a smith learns when iron is ready. Their judgments kept the peace not only by punishing faults, but by remembering that honor is a currency that can be exchanged without blood when men will allow it. Alongside them stood the filly and the learned men, keepers of song and memory, makers of praise and satire. A good poem could build a life. A sharp one could topple a fool from his chair. No ruler despised poets for long without learning what the cold wind of silence feels like in a hall that believes itself fine. Over all of this lay the older way in which fate binds a person with cords that only a wise man sees. These bindings were Giza. They were vows and taboos tailored to a single life. A king might be forbidden to hunt in a certain wood, or to sleep in a certain house, or to refuse a certain kind of guest. He might be required to pay first at a fair, or to rise at dawn on a particular day to greet the Sunday. Break one of these bonds, and the world would bend toward ruin with a swiftness that felt like an answer. Keep them, and strength gathered around a rein like bees around a hive. Men feared Giza and loved them. They made a life feel like a work of art set within a frame. Of the kings who wore terror as a crown, Cormac Mac shines with a light that is both gentle and stern. His birth already bore the seal of marvel. A salmon is said to have guarded him as an infant when he was hidden from enemies. He grew into a man whose judgments read like clean lines struck across a page that had been smudged by passion. He is remembered for a book of counsels, the teachings of Cormac, in which a father tells a son how to govern men without breaking them. Do not quarrel with a poet, he says, for satire is a sword you cannot parry. Protect the weak, for a throne without mercy sits on sand. He understood that a king must be a house for law rather than a spear raised above it. Another tale tells how the sea itself became his tutor. Cormac sat in his hall one day when a stranger entered with a branch hung with silver fruit. Each bell, like fruit, chimed when the branch moved, and every sound eased pain as surely as a hand on the brow. Cormac offered a fair price, and the man agreed, but soon after came again to take the branch, claiming it by right. He led Cormac to a strange shore where time moved like a tide without a moon. There the king saw wonders and learned a lesson that fed his rule. The stranger was Manannan, lord of the sea and giver of fair bargains, if fairness sat already in a heart. From that meeting, some say, Cormac gained a cup that broke when lies were spoken over it, and mended when 3 truths were told. The cup is a story more than an object, yet it holds meaning as firm as metal. A kingdom that tolerates lies breaks itself. A ruler who reminds his people to speak truth repairs what pride and fear have cracked. The fires of terror kept the pact between land and crown in ritual form. Every 3rd year, in older tellings, the High King gathered lords and judges and poets. The feast renewed law and friendship. Contracts were checked. Measures were weighed. Old quarrels were scrubbed out like soot from a hearth. There was also the quieter rite of marriage to the sovereignty of the land. Sometimes a tale makes that rite into a bright emblem. A king meets a woman at a ford or a well. She is old and dreadful to look upon. Her hair hangs in ropes. Her breath is rank. She asks for a kiss. If the king refuses, the land refuses him. If he meets her eyes and kisses her with respect, she becomes a maiden and the fields answer. The story says that power and beauty do not come cheap. They come to those who honor what seems unlowly in its first shape. Conaire Mór stands as a warning written with the steadiness of a careful hand. He was a just man, a lover of peace, a king whose reign felt like a well-kept summer. He took the throne under many guasa. Do not hunt birds, for you are the fosterling of the bird people. Do not pass terror by night. Do not let robbers travel your roads. Do not allow 3 red men in a house where you sleep. The demands seem strange until a reader learns that strangeness is exactly how fate speaks when it wishes to be remembered. One night, Conaire found himself pressed by accident and by necessity to break one after another. A flock flew before him, and his men shot in hunger. He travelled late and passed terror under cloud. He admitted guests whose coming matched the letter of a warning, and soothed the doubt with hope that the spirit of the warning would not hold. At Durga's hostile enemies gathered thick as thatch. Fire crackled through rafters. Conaire held his ground until his ground was ash. The tale does not accuse him of cowardice. It accuses him of forgetting that a king must keep his bindings exact even when the world calls the precision foolish. Men do not expect a king to die in a guest house with smoke in his lungs. The story does, and it teaches others to live by humility rather than by charm. Not every king's story ends in ruin. Tuatha fought his way back from exile and set the 5 provinces in order. like a craftsman resetting a wheel that has lost its true round. He is remembered for a tribute called the Boromar, a payment in cattle that Leinster was forced to bring to Tara after a wrong that stained the land. That tale hardened into tradition so tightly that later saints and kings would argue about it, when they tried to exchange old burdens for new graces. Lugh Loy went abroad and returned with chariots that breathed fire, a romantic flourish that tells more about how men wanted to imagine the strength of a returning prince than it tells about iron, Diamat, Nax. Sobel died by a curse that tied sovereignty to a love that could not be shared. These figures do not live only as names in a list. They live as weights in a scale. Each adds a grain to the balance between power and justice. The dream of sovereignty appears again in the tale of the sons of Eochaid Magmaidan and in the rise of Niall of the Nine Hostages. A queen named Mongfiend loved her own sons and feared the favour shown to Niall. She sent them to a smith for a trial by fire that was meant to shame. Niall came back with a shield for each brother and with a sword for himself. A neat bit of storytelling that signals rank without a trumpet. On a hunt, the brothers came to a well guarded by a loathly woman who asked for a kiss as the price of water. For refused and rode away thirsty. Niall accepted, not dutifully, but gladly. She changed under his mouth into a radiant figure who named herself Sovereignty. She gave him the drink and promised that his line would rule. The lesson writes itself. A king who will not endure what is hard will not earn what is sweet. A king who honors what seems beneath honor will find honor at his side when danger enters his house. The cycles of story grow nearer to chronicle as kings learn to live with saints as well as poets. Yet even when the cross rises on hills that once held fire, older lights do not go out at a breath. The monks who set these tales in script were not only collectors, they were interpreters. They set the gods into the past as ancient kings and heroes and called their wonders great deeds rather than miracles. This habit has a learned name, but its meaning is plain. It allowed holy men to map the new faith onto the old allegiance without tearing the map. It allowed people to keep the names they loved and to place them at a distance that was safe. Cushane remained a hero. Fon remained a captain. Lugh kept his spear as a pattern for courage rather than as a rival to any saint. The old order of law did not vanish. It was gathered and sifted. The Cenasm, a great body of law, set down customs that had been carried in minds and mouths. It spoke of fosterage, a practice that bound families together tighter than blood by placing children in the care of others. It spoke of fines and honour prices, of the compensation owed when a wrong was done, and of the dignity a person carried in the market of respect. It spoke of satists who misused their art and of the penalty for breaking hospitality. It restrained kings, for a king who exceeds his rights breaks the field he thinks he is fencing. It protected poets, for a poet who fears cannot tell the truth that meets power like a cold wind. Terror did not sit alone. Rathcrogan and Connacht looked out across a country that knew how to move armies and how to weave feasts. In Marcher lay in its ring of earth, with memories as bright and as bitter as a blade. Cruachan rose, and the caves beneath it breathed stories about queens and about the hard bargains the other world makes when people knock at its door without knowing who waits inside. These places were not ruins to those who spoke about them. They were theatres that still held echoes, and a man who walked there felt taller or smaller, depending on how he had lived that week. A kingdom also lives in its roads and its fords. The 5 roads of terror mattered because they carried not only people, but promises. A man who swore to bring cattle by the Sligo Moor knew that his oath would be measured by the hoofprints counted along that line. A king who pledged to keep a ford safe in autumn knew that traders would remember a single ambush for longer than a single triumph. Water was a judge in Ireland. Oaths were sworn at fords. Men who lied there found that the cold bit deep into their lips. Men who told the truth found that the rivers seemed to run warmer for a step or two. Kings learned to fear satire because they had learned to love praise. A good praise poem steadies a throne like a beam placed under a roof. It tells the people what a ruler has done and what he should do again. It names the cattle driven in, and the strangers entertained, and the judgments that caused men to nod in crowded rooms. A harsh poem strips paint from a door. It tells the people that a feast was mean, or that a gift was hedged. It tells women that their toil will not be honoured. It tells foster sons that their father has refused a loan. No true father would refuse. The power of words does not sit apart from swords. It sits among them and sets the point of each in or out of alignment. The historical cycle grows darker around its edges as time carries new rulers into the old seats. Some kings loved the stone and the law and held both as a father holds a sleeping child. Others tried to use terror as a stage from which to pretend to powers the island had never granted. When ambition pressed too hard, the land pressed back. A drought comes, and a king who has forgotten to feed poets finds their silence heavy as lead. A plague comes, and a king who has allowed strange judgments suffers no comfort when the dead fill all the rooms. A raid from across the scenes, and a king who has bought an ally with compliments instead of cattle fines, himself alone on a strand that knows too many such mornings. Long memory works for and against those who sit on ancient chairs. Yet for all this sternness, the stories do not lose their pleasure. We still hear of feasts at which the champion's portion sets pride on edge, and then eases it with laughter. We still hear of a host gathered under the banner of a high king who stands at the mouth of a tent and speaks, names that mean courage every time they are said. We still hear of young men racing at Lumnasad, and young women choosing amid cheers, and of old people whose eyes fill when they see strength unshadowed by grief for a few hours. There is a happiness in a country that has learned to harness itself to custom without letting custom become a cage. The last notes of the old music do not fall silent so much as they sink below the edge of hearing. Ween sits by a new saint and speaks, and the saint listens as any wise man listens when truth arrives in a shape he did not expect. Kings in later years look out to ward mounds and remember that the door between this world and the next is thin. They remember that to keep a vow matters more than to save a face. They remember that a cup will break when a lie is told, and that the way to repair a cracked thing is to tell truth more than once. The poets who write with quills sharpened under a cross still borrow the rhythm of older lines. They praise justice. They warn against pride. They remind the reader to feed the stranger and to spare the singer and to bow the head when passing a lone tree in a field. The cycles do not fall away from one another like peeled bark. They braid. The gods step inside the hills and listen. The heroes of Stir fall, and their names become oaths spoken by men who never saw a chariot. The Fianna range through wood and moor and teach a country to think of law as hospitality made public. The kings take the hill and learn to carry the weight of an island that will judge them by harvest and by fairness in equal measure. The monks gather the strands and knot them so that future readers can lift the cord without dropping it. To read one cycle is to feel the pull of the others. To stand at Terra in imagination is to hear the hammers of Gonu and the laughter of Fon and the cry of the leaf isle under a true foot. Walk the ridge at Terra today in your mind and bring all of this with you. The grass is short. The sky is honest. The ringworks lie like sleeping things that still listen to the wind. Say the names that suit the place. Cormac, Conair, Tall Nile. Say the other names that breathe there, whether or not you speak them. Lugh, Brigid, the Dagda. Feel how the place takes the names without jealousy and gives them back without confusion. That is the legacy of the cycles. They are not a pageant of strangers who left no trace. They are the ground under a present footstep. They are the rules that make a generous house. They are the warning that any ruler who loves a chair more than a people will soon have neither. They are the courage of boys at Afford, and the patience of hunters in rain, and the gentleness of a woman who keeps a fire banked and a pot on when she expects guests she has never met. A story must end, but a tradition does not. It shifts its chair and clears its throat and starts again with a new singer. The myths of Ireland survive because the island has a habit of remembering. Stones keep warmth after sunset. Water keeps the taste of metal long after a spear has been washed in it. Roads remember the stride of a king who never hurried. Songs remember the breath of a woman who slept under enchantment and woke under kindness. The cycles took the first duty of any great tale and met it. They turned a place into a person. They made Ireland into a character who can be praised, who can be wronged, who can forgive, and who can call her children to be better than they are. This concludes our journey from the misty islands of Celtic mythology, filled with heroism and the belief in an eternal cycle. My life was illuminated by the power of sacred trees, oak, the promise of rebirth, and the irresistible battle fervour Ryastrad of the hero tool Tulane. For the Celts, death was a journey to the fairy realm in Unwin. This shows that the wheel of destiny turns constantly. Dagda's boundless cauldron always symbolized abundance and rebirth. The magical arts of the Tuatha De Danann permeated every aspect of this mystical life. Having learned the secrets of the Celts' spiritual and nature-intertwined life, don't forget to subscribe for our next adventure. Perhaps the secrets of ancient Egyptian gods.